safe and well. Welcome to the final session of the Global Freedom and Democracy series, a partnership between MBC and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Today's guest speaker is Stanford professor and best-selling author Dr. Larry Diamond, who will share his insights on the state of global democracy. Dr. Diamond is a leading scholar on what he has labeled as the democratic recession. We're also pleased to be joined by our board members today, Risa Mantaring, Ramon del Rosario, Lito Tayag, and Itos Cruz. Also joining us are Ambassador Gerard Ho of Singapore and Ambassador Stephen Robinson of Australia. To start, we'd like to hold a quick poll for everyone, a quick survey. We invite you to answer the survey that's being flashed on your screens right now. The question there is, do you agree that democracy is in a global recession? 5 possible questions there. I'll give you a couple of seconds to answer that. Dr. Diamond will explain global recession later on, but for now, based on what you might understand about it, is the answer that we'd like to elicit from you at this moment. Couple more seconds. Okay, let's see the answer. Let's see the result. Agree has about 50%. Strongly disagree has 0% here. 20% for strongly agree. Okay, before we turn over to Dr. Diamond, may I call on Ambassador Joey Quisha for some brief opening remarks. Ambassador Quisha.
Thank you, Coco. Excellencies of the Diplomatic Corps, our esteemed speaker, Dr. Larry Diamond, Dr. Stefan Joost, my fellow MBC trustees, members and guests, good morning to everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the second session of the 2020 Global Freedom and Democracy series, a joint project of Makati Business Club and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. This series stems from MBC's belief that freedom and democracy are not just our rights, but also the foundation for human and national development. We're pleased to partner with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, a leader in promoting these ideals around the world since 1955 and in the Philippines since 1964. MBC and KAS are gladdened to welcome so many partners and future partners today to inspire each other in the great work we're doing and will be doing for a while. The Freedom House Democracy Index says global freedom has been in decline for the past 14 years, evidenced by growing inequalities from globalization, the rising number of civil protests, and the rise of populist agendas due to disinformation and the imperfect governance some of us have been a part of. This so-called democratic recession is only exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. With that background, we are privileged to be joined today by Dr. Larry Diamond, who says it best in his book, and I quote, "None of this is a cry of despair. All of it is a call to arms," unquote. Dr. Diamond is a real thought leader in modern democracy from his perch at Stanford University, where he is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute. Last year, he published a book entitled Ill Winds: Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. It is an excellent analysis on the shortcomings of liberal democracy and a roadmap for democratic resurgence. Dr. Diamond, we're all looking forward to hearing more on that today, especially the saving democracy part. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Alicia, for your very kind introduction. And I do want to begin by, first of all, saying what an honor it is for me to be able to speak to the Makati Business Club. I have been aware of your distinguished record of civic contributions over the decades, and I've long looked forward to this opportunity. and therefore I particularly want to apologize for the previous mix-up with regard to my participation, I think a couple weeks ago. When you say the word mix-up, you usually mean there was a failure of communication. In this case, I want to stress the mix-up was only in my own mind and was completely my fault, and had nothing to do with any failure on the part of the Makati Business Club, whose patience, understanding, and grace I would like to testify to in almost religious terms. With that, I would now like to share my screen and briefly show you all some slides that will explain why I think we're in a democratic recession. So if you will give me just a minute to do that. Looks like trying to find my, here we go. Okay, are you seeing my slides okay?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so let's begin. I want to first show you this slide, which shows you two trend lines from 1974 through 2019. The top line, which is in light blue, shows the trend in terms of the percentage of states in the world over 1 million population that can be said to meet a minimal test of electoral democracy. And you can see that there was a gradual ascent of that percentage in the first decade and a half of what Samuel Huntington called the third wave of global democratization. And we see here that by the time the Philippines made its historic transition back to democracy in 1986, about a third of all the states in the world were democracies. And then, of course, we had transitions in Korea, then Taiwan, further in Latin America, and then the big bang of democratic change in Central and Eastern Europe. And by the early 1990s, for the first time in the history of the world, a majority of states in the world, and a majority of states over 1 million population, were democracies. And that kept rising up until about 2006 to 57%. Over the last 14 years, we have seen a modest but steady slippage in the percent of states that are democracies. And I argue that during the last calendar year of 2019, we saw for the first time since the end of the Cold War, this proportion slip below 50%. The bottom line is the percentage of states that meet a higher standard of liberal democracy with good control of corruption, judicial independence, and a rule of law. And that has also been declining more modestly. I believe Coco made a reference to the Freedom House data on 14 years of democratic recession. And here you see it in this famous slide that shows the ratio of countries gaining in freedom every year to the number that are declining in freedom every year. And you can see from the end of the Cold War through 2005, the ratio was very favorable, sometimes as much as 2.5 times as many countries gaining in freedom as declining. That stopped in 2006, and since 2007, only about 50 to 70% as many countries have gained in freedom each year as have declined. And you see it's been a very steady pattern. We see it separately if we divide the third wave of global democratization into 4 separate waves and just track how many democracies in each decade broke down. These are 11-year periods to accommodate the 44-year period. And we see the failure rate was 14% from 1976 to 86, fell to under 11% in each of the following two 11-year periods. And then in the most recent long decade, from 2009 through last year, the failure rate has spiked considerably to 19% of all the existing democracies failing during this last 11-year period. And in the whole 44-year period, 35% of all the democracies have failed. Here again, using Freedom House data, the 100-point scale of political rights and civil liberties, where 0 is the worst score and 100 is the best, we see the trends from the beginning of the third wave in the beginning of the democratic recession in 2006 through the end of last year. And you can see the decline in the United States, the thick red line, a sharp decline in this orange line here for Mexico from 93 down to 70, the worst descent actually of any of these big, significant, interesting countries. The green line is South Africa, which has also been steadily declining from 88 to 79. The light blue line here at bottom is the Philippines, which declined from 2005 at 72 down to a low under President Macapagal Arroyo of 57. You can see it bounced back under President Aquino to a peak of 65, and then has declined significantly during the last, 3.5 years or so under President Duterte. What have been the causes of the democratic crisis in these recent years? Well, as you know well, in the Philippines, conditions of corruption, of extensive crime, insecurity, inequality, and so on, can give scope for illiberal populists and others who show hostility to liberal values and democracy to make an appeal to the public and even win elections. In the established liberal democracies of Europe, North America, and so on, a contributing factor has been accelerating globalization, a lot of fear in Europe of losing sovereignty and control, fear that Donald Trump has been exploiting of cultural and religious pluralism and of immigration. Social media, I think you well understand, in the Philippines have been a contributing factor to this polarization, giving vent to manipulation, disinformation, hostility, and the venting of a lot of prejudice and low-quality information. We've seen authoritarian populist leadership models taking hold in countries like Hungary and Turkey, and some people think elsewhere in countries that we are more familiar with. And then these models diffuse to other countries. Certainly the weakening of liberal democracy in the US and the ebbing of our commitment to promoting democracy has given scope to autocrats to become bolder in assaulting democratic values. And as I say in my book, thank you kindly for mentioning it, the rise or resurgence of authoritarianism in Russia and China and their desire to support authoritarian regimes elsewhere in the world has been a big factor. I spoke about illiberal populism. Let me deconstruct it by noting these elements, these 7 elements of the formula of illiberal populism. It's anti-elitist. It bashes elites as opposed to the people. All elites, even though ironically it's often elites who embrace this formula. It's anti-institutionalist and fans acute distrust and suspicion of all established institutions. It's opposed to pluralism, to the idea that there can be legitimate differences and political disagreements in society. And therefore, it's intolerant of religious, ethnic, and cultural minorities because it lifts up in its hegemonic claim the dominant group or the majority of the population is the true people, and anybody who disagrees or is different as kind of the enemies of the true people. It's plebiscitary. It doesn't believe in representative democracy. The illiberal populist, ultimately authoritarian ruler, wants to establish a direct relationship between himself or occasionally herself and, quote, the people. And so it tends to descend into hyper-nationalism. The descent involves what I have identified as the Autocrats' 12-step program. They begin by demonizing and delegitimating the political opposition and the media as enemies of the people. They go after the independence of the courts and try and purge the higher courts of people who might think and rule independently. They try to gain control of public broadcasting and ultimately of private media as well. They constrain internet freedom, and then they go after civil society, NGOs, universities, think tanks, try and intimidate and silence them from open criticism. They intimidate and squeeze the business community into submission, often in the later stages of their authoritarian ascent, threatening independent businessmen with tax prosecution and other forms of punishment if they don't fall into line. By contrast, they seek to enrich a loyal class of crony capitalists who will get rich by doing their bidding. They extend political control over the state bureaucracy, the security establishment, and regulatory agencies, so they can't be held accountable. And ultimately, they try to get control of the electoral rules and electoral administration so they can just keep winning elections. I'll just say, I don't have time to go over this now, a lot of these threats, manipulations, intimidation, disinformation, arrests, and misuse of state power have gotten much worse during the pandemic because authoritarian rulers are trying to use the pandemic as cover to justify their intensification and concentration of power. Let me close by noting that there are ways that we can fight this descent into authoritarian populism and assault on democratic institutions, but it isn't by playing into the populist instinct to polarize. I think this is the most important thing that I can say in this lecture, actually, is don't play into the game of the authoritarian populist in terms of trying to intensify polarization and difference. Opponents need to create a big tent that speaks to and welcomes in previous supporters of the authoritarian populist, rather than dismissing everyone who might have appointed him as evil or stupid or backward or something like that. They need to speak to the real bread and butter daily concerns of people, both economic concerns and concerns about corruption and crime that might have motivated the electoral drift toward the illiberal populists. And let me say, I don't know of a single instance of a rising illiberal populist that hasn't resulted in gross corruption and abuse of power, because they all want to eliminate the checks on their functioning and their power by ombudsmen, human rights commissions, independent media, and so on. And we all know that when you eliminate independent checks, independent monitors, independent prosecutors, independent journalists, it's the road to hell in terms of accountability and control of corruption. I think that the opponents of authoritarian populism can identify reforms to improve democracy, But sadly, we generally don't find that people vote out populists simply because they are committed to democracy. You have to speak to their substantive concerns as well. This means embracing and not rejecting what we call civic form of nationalism, in which people take pride in their country, but note that democracy and personal freedom are an integral part of what makes the nation great. And to do this, I come back to where I began on this slide. We have to unite and enhance and enlarge the coalition, pushing back for freedom rather than polarize. And that means mobilizing very broad, cross-cutting civil society alliances, which is something that I think the Makati Business Club has been in the habit of doing over the years. So thank you very much. And now I will answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diamond, especially for the last couple of checklists. As you were going through them, some of the conversations that were going on in the background said it seemed like a checklist of what's happening in some countries, maybe including here. Before we go on to the questions, I'd like, and now that Dr. Diamond has explained what a recession is, you remember at the beginning, almost 50% of you said that we are in a recession. The next question now, in this next survey, before we go to the questions, could you call up the survey, please? Is when do you think we're going to come out of the democratic recession? Is it 2 years? Is it 5 to 10 years? Or will it take a generation? I'm going to give you a few seconds to answer that question. And then before we go to your questions, we'll show the result of that. And that will give us a leveling off. A few more seconds for that. 2 years, 5 to 10 years, or one generation. Okay, could we see the answer to that? 5 to 10 years. So somewhere between optimistic and very pessimistic is the answer, Dr. Diamond. Dr. Diamond, before I go to the questions, let me just ask him, because this is the Makati Business Club, you said that in one of the steps there was that it's intimidating and squeezing the business community, but particularly you said it's in the latter stages. Why is it in the latter stages?
Well, it isn't always in the latter stages, but first they tend to go after the institutions that are more important to constraining their freedom of movement and their popularity in the polls. So the media are very, very important here, because if they're subject to a constant round of criticism and investigative reporting, it's going to undermine their bid for unchallenged power. And I think the pattern has been that these autocrats or incipient autocrats always start with the highest priority on going after the media and going after the courts, and often almost immediately after coming to power. And sometimes their opponents in the Congress as well. Maybe they'll identify a prominent senator and outspoken, courageous leader that they don't like and go after that kind of person. And once they get a little more comfortable and start looking to entrench their power and prepare for the next election or midterm election, the assault on the business community, which may begin early, but it tends to gain momentum gradually over time. There's no neat sequence. That is, there's no rigid and fixed sequence or model. This can vary across countries, but I've been struck by the degree to which the immediate priority is always the media, the courts, and then the opposition, the formal political opposition.
Thanks very much, Larry. We have a bunch of questions already. Roxanne Liu, our programs director, will assist me in this. Rox?
Yes, we'd like to invite Mr. Rui Moreno. Dr. Diamond, Mr. Moreno is the vice chairman of the Center for Global Practices, which is also one of the democracy advocates in the Philippines. Mr. Moreno, would you like to pose your question, please?
Yes, thank you for the presentation, Doctor. Very interesting. But I noticed that one of the comments you made was that you use the United States as the benchmark at 100. Of course, you showed it as a declining at some stages, but declining line at some stages. But how can the United States still serve as a model when many of the issues that you have brought up are also issues that are present in the U.S., particularly in relation to racial inequality, etc. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. And let me say, it was not my intention in showing that slide to suggest that the U.S. is a model. If you saw, the U.S. has declined from about 93 to 86. In fact, I think the real quality of democracy in the U.S. now, you'd have to rate well below that. And indeed, the Economist Intelligence Unit now classifies the United States as a flawed democracy at something like 26th place in the world in terms of the quality of democracy. So that was a slide, Mr. Moreno, only of some prominent democracies, all of which have been in decline. I think if you're looking for a model, it's better to look to Germany, Canada, Sweden, Norway, countries like that, or closer to you, Taiwan, which has done a tremendous job of managing the COVID pandemic as a liberal democracy, and which I think has even improved in the quality of democracy in recent years under extraordinary pressures and challenges. Let me say about the United States with all candor and all humility that there used to be a time when we saw, even with the flaws we acknowledged at the time, the US as a kind of what Ronald Reagan was fond of quoting from another observer in an earlier century, a shining city on a hill, a model that could inspire others and at least provide some lessons. I think the shine is certainly off that model now, and most of us in the US who engage in and try and support democratic development around the world are keenly aware of the fact that we are now having to use in the United States many of the strategies of fighting illiberal populism and trying to defend democratic institutions and values that we've tried to help other Democrats and civil society organizations around the world embrace in their own battles. So we're facing very, very serious challenges here. We take nothing for granted, and I think I and most of my colleagues in, quote, this business of democracy promotion would not hold up the U.S. as a great model right now.
Thank you, Doctor.
Dr. Diamond, it's obvious that you triggered a lot of our guests this morning. We have a lot of questions in queue. May I invite the Senior Advisor of the American Chamber of Commerce, Mr. John Forbes. Please ask your question. Mr. Forbes?
I'm trying to unmute. Am I unmuted?
Okay, great.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Diamond, great to see you. And I'd like you to say hello to former Secretary George Shultz and former U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines, Michael Armacost, if they're associated with Stanford. They know a lot of democracy in the Philippines from 1986.
Right.
My question goes back to a proposition that the World Bank put out about 20 years ago, about democracy in Asia and the need for authoritarian government in order to move the economic development of the country up to a point where there was a middle class that was capable of being democratic. And we've seen, you mentioned Taipei, it's incredibly democratic in Taiwan and in Korea today, and Japan, of course. But now you have poorer countries that are far less developed, like Indonesia and, of course, India, which have quite a different model. Could you update us on the old World Bank view, please?
I'm not sure even the World Bank holds to that view anymore, although it is, John, kind of a resurgent view now that we're in a democratic recession and now that China is claiming to have handled the coronavirus better than better than democracies around the world, even though, of course, we wouldn't have a global pandemic if it hadn't been for the authoritarian suppression of information about the outbreak of the pandemic in Wuhan in December of last year. I don't think the argument about stages, that you need authoritarianism to develop and then you can get to democracy and liberal democracy comes later, is very compelling in the face of the evidence. First of all, you know, I study lots of different places in the world, not only Asia. I actually began my career by studying sub-Saharan Africa. And it's quite stunning the extent to which the people of sub-Saharan Africa, who are the poorest and least educated in the world, adhere to democratic values, and not just the word democracy, but deeper elements of liberal democracy like judicial independence, independent media, checks on executive power, and freedom of speech and information, and so on. You mentioned Indonesia. You know, I'm not saying democracy in Indonesia is perfect, but look, you know, over the last 20 years now, it's been surprisingly resilient, a lot more resilient than we would have imagined. I am worried about India. I think it's got a classic authoritarian populist as prime minister now, and a man and a movement in the BJP and the RSS behind him who are demagogic in exploiting identity grievances and fears and pejorative sentiments about Muslims and so on in a very dangerous and potentially explosive way. But if you look around the world, the enemies of democracy, even in poor countries, they tend to be the elites and not the people. And there is considerable support in a lot of lower income countries for democratic checks and balances and freedoms and so on and so forth. And if we could just get the elites to behave better, I think that we would have a better prospect. I don't think you can say, moreover, that, which is a core element of this authoritarian developmentalism philosophy or theory, that autocracies do better than democracies in terms of economic growth. You know, in the long run, authoritarian regimes have higher highs in terms of economic growth, but they also have lower lows, that is more catastrophes. And of course, Indonesia was an example of that. Indonesia's done acceptably well, not terrific, but pretty well in terms of economic growth. So did Mongolia for a while. Taiwan and Korea have kept growing quite well after their transitions. Korea really even better than under Chun Doo-hwan. So I don't think the theory of authoritarian developmentalism actually holds up very well.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Yes, Dr. Diamond, in your June article, Democracy versus the Pandemic, you wrote that one of the ways that the downward global democratic spiral can be reversed is with the renewal of the American leadership on the global stage. And I think that this is a segue to an interesting question by Professor Renato de Castro. Professor de Castro, may I invite you to please introduce yourself first before you answer
Thank you
the question.
Thank you very much. I'm Renato de Castro. I'm an academic based in De La Salle University. I have two short questions. Number one, you mentioned about illiberal Russia and communist China as two great powers that are basically supporting this trend of global illiberalism. Among the two countries, which is a greater threat? Illiberal Russia, which just focused on Europe, or China, which is rich, which is expansionist, and which has a program of the Belt and Road Initiative directed to many developing countries, and in process also exporting its model. My second short question has to do with the election, this coming election in the United States. Just in case you have a change in administration, do we expect at least the tide turning against illiberal democracy, or even the possibility of a pushback against illiberal democracy globally? Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. De Castro, you don't pick China and Russia because they're going to be the source of our vaccine, is it?
No, don't expect that vaccine. Don't trust those vaccines from those countries.
And
scientific data, yeah.
Regarding a change of government, we apologize to Dr. Diamond for taking him away from watching the Republican convention going on right now.
Yeah, it's a huge sacrifice that I'm making. Excellent questions. Of course, the threat of disinformation and subversion of democracy by Russia, and more overt hard power threats to democracy by Russia, including the intervention that is already beginning to unfold to try and quash the movement for democracy and electoral integrity in Belarus. It's very personal to us in the US, both because we have a lot of friends in Central and Eastern Europe and on the Russian periphery in Ukraine, Armenia, and so on, Georgia, that have felt the threat, the kind of heat of Russian pressure and intervention. And because I think that without Russia's intervention in the 2016 presidential election in the United States, Donald Trump would not have been elected president of the United States. Now, that's a controversial view, but the former director of national intelligence, James Clapper, came to the same conclusion in his book. But I have no doubt that the more global, long-term, deeper, more comprehensive and insidious challenge is posed by China, which has 10 times the population of Russia, an increasingly, larger GDP than Russia. At some point, perhaps soon, China will have the largest economy in the world, though certainly not in per capita terms, which has been relentlessly stealing high technology over the last 20 to 30 years and plowing it into the modernization of the People's Liberation Army, the PLA Navy, Air Force, space weaponry, artificial intelligence, and other conventional and unconventional means of projecting sharp power and military power. You don't have to live in the Philippines to see what an existential threat to freedom of navigation and freedom in general this is in the Asia-Pacific region. But if you live on the perimeter of the South China Sea, I think it is increasingly obvious. And of course, you won an international court case on just this point. My beef is not with the Chinese people, who I really love and admire, or with Chinese culture or history or anything. This is a Communist Party in control of China, with aggressive, grandiose and I think viciously authoritarian ambitions. And if you have any doubt of the vicious nature of these authoritarian ambitions, I would just like to mention the names Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. Now, to answer your second question, you know, I think that this is, I agree with Joe Biden that democracy is on the ballot in the United States this year. I think we have a president who has contempt for democracy and liberal values and peddles lies and disinformation to try to make his case and promote fear. If you go down the 7 elements of authoritarian populism, I think he checks every single box. And if you go down the Autocrats 12-step program, you will see a lot of intent on his part to try to use these mechanisms that he hasn't gotten as far as Viktor Orban in Hungary or Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey have done, I think owes to the strength and resilience of our countervailing institutions. But we have a lot of work to do to defend our democratic institutions and values at home. I will say, in concluding my response to your question, that there is this kind of odd situation where there is unambiguously, in my view, an illiberal populist with authoritarian inclinations at the head of our government. But beneath that, there are many skilled and democratically committed people who continue to work in the Foreign Service, in the State Department, in other parts of our foreign policy, who care about human rights and freedom in the world, who are trying to check the expansion of Chinese power in the world, not primarily because they want to keep China down, but because they see it as an existential threat to freedom in the world, who are quietly working to try to protect people at risk and defend human rights. And we have many in the Congress who are doing the same and are passing legislation to address the threat of sharp power that both China and Russia pose. So it's a very strange situation in that sense where, yes, people in the administration, of course, have to defend their president, and most Republicans in Congress have to do so at least rhetorically. But when you get them in a room privately, many of them have different attitudes and are certainly working across party lines in the United States to try to promote democracy and fight authoritarianism.
While we're on the subject of China, gentlemen in the queue list, pardon me, I will bump up a related question. May I invite Ms. Emily Lau, former Democratic Party member of the Hong Kong Legislative Council, to please ask her question. It's very related to the one answered by Professor Diamond. Ms. Lau?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yes, thank you, Professor Diamond. We last met in Taipei in June last year, where you spoke so eloquently about the need for reciprocity, and which I have, of course, plagiarized. I have repeated on many occasions. I want to ask Professor Diamond a question. Right now in Hong Kong, we are, of course, faced with this virus, this pandemic, and the Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, has used that excuse to postpone the Legislative Council election for 1 year. It's supposed to be next month, but now she's postponed for 1 year. But many people think the real reason is that the pro-communist camp fear they will lose the election like they lost the District Council election last November. But some people in our camp think that And then, of course, Beijing said, okay, because it's postponed, all the members can continue to serve for at least 1 more year until the next election. But some people in our camp think that it is illegitimate because we've only been elected to serve 4 years. How dare you serve 1 more day or 1 more year? But others argue that, come on, go in and serve. So my party, the Democratic Party, is now going to sponsor an opinion survey to find out what the people think, and then they will follow the result of the survey. So, Professor Diamond, what do you think we should do? Thank you.
Well, Emily, it's great to hear your voice, and you know, just my heart goes out to you and the brave people of Hong Kong. It's one of the most important and inspiring struggles of our time, your relentless determination to defend what freedom was given to you and left to you in 1997 during the handover, and is now rapidly being taken away. I was asked this same question by one of your journalists, I don't know, about a week ago. And I haven't changed my mind in a week, so I'll give you the answer I gave him. I have rarely seen a boycott or withdrawal from a legislative arena that winds up being effective. I'm not saying it can never happen, but usually it becomes a gift to the authoritarian regime when Democrats give up a tool that they have and an arena that they have, and then the regime can manipulate that and just run roughshod over the opposition. And my strong appeal to the democratic people of Hong Kong is, you know, to use the old aphorism, don't cut off your nose to spite your face. Don't surrender a tool that you have that can be one of the tools and one of the arenas of resistance just because it's been abused and degraded by the regime. Make use of every available tool and every available space to fight, to resist, to challenge, and to denounce. And the LegCo remains, I think, despite now the illegitimacy that Carrie Lam and the Chinese Communist Party, who are her instructors and who issue her orders from Beijing, despite what they've done, it's still an arena. And I think what Democrats in Hong Kong should do is say, the arena is now illegitimate, the government is illegitimate, but we're not going to do the HKSAR government the favor of giving them hegemonic and unilateral control of the LegCo for a year. We will constantly denounce the illegitimacy of this, but use all available space to resist, denounce, and rally support.
Thanks, Dr. Diamond. Thanks, Emily. Rox?
Yes, Coco. May we invite Mr. Sam Shutik to please, before asking your question, please introduce yourself and the organization you belong to.
Thanks, Roxanne. Yeah, I'm the country representative for the Asia Foundation in the Philippines. Super presentation, Dr. Diamond, fascinating. So a good follow-on from the Hong Kong question, in which there's particular focus on the LegCo and how to use that as a tool for protecting the democratic system. Similarly interested in whether, in your point earlier in your presentation about corruption as one of those bellwethers of authoritarian populist regimes, and also a particular vulnerability, because as you said, one of their key desires is to remove checks and balances. So interested to hear your perspectives on other examples in which countries or movements, citizens have been able to use protection of one particular institution amongst the suite of courts, oversight bodies, media, and so on, as a vehicle for protecting the greater democratic system.
Well, thank you, Sam. I'm a longtime friend and collaborator of the Asia Foundation. I've met some of your fellow country representatives in the region. I'm sorry, I don't think I've had the pleasure of meeting you, but I appreciate your question. I think the answer can be expressed in a single word: mobilize. Certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, when democratically elected authorities tried to mess with these agents of horizontal accountability, as you say, the ombudsman, anti-corruption czars, things like that, people came out into the streets to protest, sometimes in large numbers. And of course, members of the parliament resisted and spoke out. And the media advocated. The problem is, it's one thing to do this, say in a country like Romania, where there are kind of stirrings and maybe incipient tendencies toward illiberal populism, but they're not very far along. And so resistance can really make a difference and sometimes be effective. Whereas, you know, once a country has gone as far as Hungary has, or Turkey, it's much harder to rein it in. And so I think that the lesson of a lot of these countries, we're seeing it now in Argentina, by the way, where the new Peronist government is going after the anti-corruption leader, the chief anti-corruption czar, who has been forced out, and other such officials as well. You got to mobilize early. The earlier you mobilize, the better the prospect of success. And you have to mobilize on multiple fronts. There's a role for media and independent reporting and opinionating. There's a role for public street demonstrations. There's a role for social media advocacy and education. And there's a role, to the extent that the parliamentary opposition has the opportunity, to make the case in parliament as well. Now, sometimes, you know, you get to a situation, I think it kind of prevails in the Philippines now, where you've got an illiberal populace that has a congressional or parliamentary majority, or working majority, and it becomes a little more difficult to present barriers in the way. But still, I think it's very important to educate the people. Often people don't understand who these institutions and actors are and why they're so important to defending good government, honest government, human rights, and so on. So public education, public mobilization, public defense through a variety of means in civil society, the media, and independent members of Congress, I think these are all critical. And the earlier, the better.
Thanks.
Dr. Diamond, we have a very quick question here from Dr. Edilberto de Jesus of the Asian Institute of Management, EDJ. Could you please ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Diamond, for your presentation. We do appreciate the advice that those opposed to a populist president should adopt a big tent strategy and should avoid further polarizing the environment. It seems to be difficult to implement this advice in practice. In 2016, after the election of President Duterte, the social weather station, the longest serving institution that does opinion polling, told us that public morale had never been higher. But in the course of the last 3 years, the polarizing pressure has really come from the administration in the kind of policies that they have been pushing. Therefore, particularly now, we just heard, I was just listening to the president's briefing. The narrative is, at this time of the COVID crisis, the population should just not criticize the government. The duty of the citizens is to follow. And further resisting or opposing policies of the government will only aggravate the situation. At this time, when there are policies that or initiatives that are being pushed that seem to be really beyond the pale, what is the recourse for the opposition groups whose criticism is regarded as inherently polarizing? Thank you.
Of all the questions I've been asked tonight, and of all the questions I've been asked in these kinds of conversations in the last few months, I think that's the most difficult one for me to answer. And the reason why is that I want to have enough humility to recognize that I can't answer every question, and not every country-specific question can be confidently answered on the basis of comparative experience or theory. I think there's a lot of country-specific nuance that enters in to these political dynamics. How popular is the president at any particular moment? You know, what is the nature of the rhetoric and the political divisions and public opinion? I have seen the polls you're referring to. I find them alarming and depressing. I won't say exactly what I think of your president, but you know what I think of my president. I think there's a lot of similarity between them. You know, I do think that you can always do something to advance democratic principles, call out misuse of power and policy mistakes, and the something in the language has to be sensitive to timing and to the nuances of public opinion. Here I would really recommend to you the work, the brilliant, path-breaking work, which has had a lot of influence on my thinking, of the Yale political scientist Milan Svolik, S-V-O-L-I-K, who's noted, I think his work will really resonate with you, that, you know, in his public opinion polling and scenario playing in the United States, so forget about the Philippines, you don't get very far by only focusing on the alleged authoritarian transgressions of the populist leader. And so you need to find language, you need to find angles, and you need to find moments that will pull people away. And, you know, if he's writing at 7% popularity in the polls, you know, your public interventions may need to be a little more oblique, and maybe you don't exactly go after the the president personally or question his motives, but focus on actions, on policies, on people around him. But I do know, or I feel more confident in saying the following. This I keep returning to. Number one, all populist leaders want to polarize and divide. And if you play into the logic of polarization and personal demonization, it's playing their game. And I think the opposition needs to change the game and the tone and the rhetoric so that you focus on issues and performance and not personalities, name calling, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, I think you have to identify with and show patriotism to the country and show sensitivity to the concerns that led people to rally behind the illiberal populist, and think about how your criticisms and the things you want to reveal speak to those concerns that people have. And third, I would look for local issues and local concerns in different parts of the country. The Philippines is a very big and dispersed country where you can make appeals to people that are more locally and regionally based. These kinds of popularity surges don't last. And if the leader gets a surge in popularity, it usually ebbs as people come to grips with the harder realities.
Dr. Diamond, we might have another tough question for you here. Dr. Stefanios, would you like to ask the question that you posted in the chat box? Dr. Yos? Okay, I can ask his question, Professor. He asked, how would you rate the quality of Filipino democracy in view of the Autocrats' 12-step program?
Well, I can tell you frankly, if you recall the slide where I showed that in 2019, the percentage of states over 1 million people that are electoral democracies for the first time in about 25 years declined to under 50%. I think one of the countries, in my view, as a political scientist, that left the category of electoral democracy and entered in 2019 and 2018, something like that, the ranks of competitive authoritarian regimes is the Philippines. You know, the problem with this kind of authoritarian slide, this incremental assault on freedom and accountability and institutional integrity in countries like, well, initially Russia and Venezuela, then Turkey, Hungary, Bangladesh, and so on, and now I would say the Philippines, is that it's all incremental. And if it's all incremental and it's death by 1,000 cuts, and you kind of gradually suffocate one institution after another, or so intimidate the opposition that they're kind of disabled, or stack the courts, and so on and so forth, it's hard to know when you've crossed the line. I compare it in some of my recent writing to crossing the Rubicon, crossing the river, but crossing it in a fog, so you don't really know exactly when it happened, that you wound up in different territory.
Thanks very much, Dr. Diamond. Dr. Yost, I'm not sure why you couldn't speak up earlier. Was that answer okay, or do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, thank you very much. I didn't unmute myself, so sorry, it was my fault.
Do you have a follow-up to that question or a reaction?
It's okay, fine. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Roxanne?
Yes, we'll jump to the question of Mr. Ron Hose. Mr. Hose, would you like to ask your question, please?
Sure. I don't know if you can hear me, but I guess, you know, kind of looking at your graph, is hard not to correlate that with the growth of internet and social media. And so my question is, what role do you see kind of technology playing in this global democratic recession, and what role does it have in reversing the trend? And I guess connected with that is, what's your view on the current kind of standoff between the U.S. Government and TikTok?
I have a chapter on social media in my book, Ill Winds. I think initially I was very enthusiastic about its liberation potential. And indeed, I started a program at Stanford in 2009 called Liberation Technology to study how the internet and social media could enable a new generation of miracles at EDSA and other popular struggles for freedom and accountability. But I think there's no doubt now that the balance of impact has been negative by feeding and enabling authoritarian disinformation and further polarizing democracy and driving people into their information silos. And also there is the threat of our losing our information and our privacy, not necessarily just to governments, but to private actors and corporations who are assembling these profiles on us to give themselves better ability to manipulate us and sell us their products and so on and so forth. So it's very sobering. I think there are lots of things we can do, which I talk about in my book, to fight disinformation, call it out, push government trolls and bots out of social media, require more transparency in political ads, as some in Congress have tried to do with the Honest Ads Act, and make the internet a safer place for democracy. But it's going to be a long struggle. We have a lot of work to do. It's going to require the internet companies to become much more responsible or face much more serious government regulation if they don't. On the forced sale of TikTok, I am ambivalent. I think that Huawei in particular represents a deep threat to the national security and the individual freedom of all democracies and open societies in the world. And I think it is an urgent imperative for the defense of freedom in the world that Huawei not be allowed to build the 5G infrastructure of the future for individual countries and capture all their data and then manipulate it. The problem is this, Ron. The Chinese Communist Party has made it clear that all private corporations are ultimately answerable in China to the Chinese Communist Party and must comply with its wishes and hand over all their data on demand. And therefore the claim, certainly by Huawei, I don't think this is open to debate really, but even by TikTok, that their data is walled off, they wouldn't hand it over if it's asked. I don't know. I'm very dubious and skeptical about it. And so if I had a 15-year-old that was active on social media, I would be strongly encouraging them not to be using a social media platform that is owned by a Chinese company, even if the company has pledged to wall off its data, because I think ultimately you just can't rely on that in the Chinese communist system.
Thanks very much, Ron and Larry. When you talk about communications there, Larry, there's a line in your book that says that we should remind ourselves that when it comes to communication, we still have the better ideas.
Yes.
So if we just get the communication part right, we should have more success.
Well, Coco, we need to fight for our ideas, and we need to find new ways and frames to express what liberal values are and why they're relevant to the era we live in. This is an intellectual as well as kind of symbolic and expressive challenge for us. Once we've done that, we have to find ways to disseminate this knowledge, information, and I hope inspiration over means and platforms that young people are using. You know, we can't just say, here's a book on Enlightenment philosophy, go read it, or liberation theology, or whatever it might be. And increasingly, you know, young people are getting their information on social media platforms with a lot of memes and photographs and in 5-minute video bites. So we have to meet young people where they are and use the styles and means and tools that they're using to campaign for and educate about the values of freedom, individual dignity, and liberal democracy.
Thanks, Larry. Roxanne?
We'd like to give the floor now to former MBC chairman and current trustee, Mr. Ramon Del Rosario Jr. RRR, please.
Thank you. Dr. Diamond, thank you very much for your presentation. It's easy to get desperate and to feel like the situation's hopeless, particularly when you see the situation where media is intimidated, and certainly so is the business community and many other institutions that otherwise would serve as a counterbalance are quite intimidated. On the other hand, there is, I think, light at the end of the tunnel, because fortunately, our Constitution provides for a one-term president, and at the end of 6 years, we do have the opportunity to elect new leaders. And I strongly feel that leadership really matters. And I think we can see from our Philippine experience from the People Power Revolution. Immediately after the People Power Revolution, we had Cory Aquino and Fidel Ramos. So we had 12 years when liberal democracy flourished. And I think even our economy flourished, and our respectability around the world really became more prominent. And then we had 12 years of corrupt governments, poor governance, and we again dipped. And then we had the second Aquino administration, and another 6 years, built around integrity, honesty, credibility. And again, we started moving upward. And now here we find ourselves in another situation. So I guess my point is leadership does matter. So the challenge before us is to hang in there and make sure that we do have the opportunity in 2 years to elect a new set of leaders, and that our Constitution is not tampered with, so that that right is removed from us. And I think that's a very, very, very critical aspect for us to fight for. So I guess, first of all, that is my view, and I just would like to invite you to comment on the importance of leadership, but I think it's clear to me that you would probably share the view. But really, the second aspect of my question is, what is the role of business in all this? Even within the Makati Business Club, we have a continuing debate among our trustees. Some of us feel strongly that business absolutely has to speak up and make its voice heard when it comes to debates on the rule of law, on human rights or other rights, even if these do not have an immediate impact on the economy. Because business is one of those institutions in society that people look up to for guidance. Business, right. Perhaps the church as well. So here, again, maybe it's more a question than anything else. Do you share the view that business has a significant role to play? Or are we overinflating our role and thinking that we matter when to most people we really do not? Thank you.
Ouch.
Oh, great questions. Of course, leadership matters tremendously, and particularly so in a presidential system. But look, you see how much leadership matters in the parliamentary system of India. So it can mean everything in a democracy. If you have a bad corrupt or authoritarian leader. I want to say the following, which will begin in a way to introduce the second question you raised. And is a point I should have made in response to an earlier question. So, obviously, people with a more liberal and democratic perspective in the Philippines are looking to the next presidential election and to the possibility of choosing a better leader and having the pendulum swing back in the way you were describing. But, you know, you've kind of suggested these cycles have been more 12 years, more often 12 years rather than 6 years. I think you have to allow for the very real possibility that another and even worse illiberal autocrat may succeed the current one and may even have in the annals of Philippine authoritarianism an all too familiar name. Let me say two things about the next electoral struggle. Well, three, and then I'll answer your question about business. Number one, everything I have learned about resisting either existing or incipient authoritarianism underscores A, the critical importance of competitive elections when they happen, even if it's in a kind of soft authoritarian or competitive authoritarian context. You can see what's going on in Belarus now in a harder authoritarianism than I think the Philippines is ever likely to have again. And the need for Democrats to unite. I just can't stress this strongly enough. And it's the lesson of 1986. You can't have three liberal Democrats, if I'm remembering correctly, that there's still no runoff presidential election in the Philippines. Is that correct? Well, it's just obvious. You just can't divide your vote.
Sure.
So if you want to know what the role of the business community can be, well, here's one suggestion I'll make. I'd say people who are committed to a democratic future in the Philippines need to, you know, get people together and knock heads, and somehow through some process, whether it's opinion polling, in Hong Kong they held a primary, whatever it might be, you better unite around one candidate and have no distance between the different options, because it's going to be an existential struggle. I am impressed. I don't know if you watched the Democratic Convention last week, but if you did, you can see how much that rallying across divisions happen in a normally very, very fractious party. Secondly, I hope that some of you might read the Journal of Democracy articles we published on fighting back against populism. I can send it to you all, and you can distribute them. There are a lot of lessons we've learned about how to be successful electorally in combating authoritarian populism. And again, in a system that is much more authoritarian now than the Philippines, namely Turkey, the liberal opposition managed to win, and then when the election was kind of taken away from them, win again by an even larger margin. The mayor's race in the largest city, Istanbul, and also in Ankara, with a very inclusive anti-polarization strategy of what they called radical love. And I urge you to study that strategy in advance of the, what will it be, 2022 presidential election in the Philippines. So there's a challenge for the business community right there. people who care about the rule of law and liberal values, not all of the business community, but that portion of it, and might be willing to help fund an opposition presidential campaign, and people in civil society, you know, get a coalition together and make it clear that, you know, folks in different parties and personality initiatives, you know, we got to rally behind one person, and we've got to find a way to find out who that candidate is going to be. Beyond that, and for the longer run, I think there's a lot the business community can do to set rules for itself that resist the tendency and lure, the siren song of crony capitalism, and try to avoid being co-opted with the lure of contracts and other means by which business can be co-opted or threatened. And maybe see if some funding can be mobilized to begin a civic education campaign, or to renew and modernize a civic education campaign for Philippine young people. You know, the problem that we have after transition, after 1986, after 1989, after a color revolution, is that we do civic education for a while, we're seized with democratic values, and then we think the battle is won, and it ebbs. And every generation needs to be reminded of what was lost in the authoritarian era, and why people struggled and made sacrifices and risked their lives and turned out by the millions for democracy. And they need to be educated about why accountability matters, why human rights matter, and why you can't just blindly throw all power in the hands of one, you know, populist leader. And that's hard work. It's work that I've already indicated has to be modernized technologically for the way young people consume information in the current era. And I think there's, both in terms of resources and in terms of messaging, there's a lot that the business community can do.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Dr. Diamond, if I have your permission, I would like to continue this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. I mentioned service.
Etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ramon and Larry. It's amazing that we have hardly mentioned COVID during this whole situation. Larry, could I ask you to pull up one of your slides on COVID, and we could jump to that? The question would be, what is the relationship between democracy or politics and governance and COVID? And Larry, if you could share that screen.
So let's see if I can get to that. Can you see it?
Yep, we can see it.
So yeah, I pulled together a lot of what I've learned about how different countries have responded. And I guess the way to summarize what I've learned is don't follow the United States. Follow Taiwan, Korea, Germany, Japan, a number of very good democracies, Norway, that have actually been able to do a pretty good job of controlling the pandemic, in Taiwan a phenomenal job, by a good government and smart, effective government. Now, look, the early opportunity to confront the virus is over, but we can still engage in public health and put public health experts out in front in terms of speaking about the virus, and not have rumors, suspicion, voodoo cures being peddled by political leaders. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of early and widespread testing for the virus. And we're now, the testing is useless unless the results are pretty rapidly known. And so I really urge all countries to be, seeking to acquire, as they become available, the new forms of testing, particularly using human saliva, that can be processed in about 15 minutes. So people can find out immediately if they're COVID positive, and if they are, they'll know that for a week or two, they've got to isolate. And they have to wear masks. We have to fight for a common ethic, call it radical love again, but in the COVID context, of being sufficiently respectful of our fellow citizens that we're all going to wear masks to avoid the transmission. Governments have had success in using big data analytics to track the infection. The ones that have done better have had a strong role for the central government to coordinate policy and the distribution of testing and supplies. The more that messaging can be transparent and consistent and led by public health experts, the better. And so widespread testing, contact tracing, use of face masks, distribution of hand sanitizer, civic consciousness and behaving in a way that slows or prevents transmissions and renews a sense of social solidarity and shared commitment to fighting the virus. These are the ways that democracies have been effective in fighting the virus.
Thanks very much, Larry. Before we go to the last question, could I ask everybody to give us some feedback on today's session? And you can do that by pointing your camera phones at the QR code that's being flashed on your screen right now. We'd really appreciate that. We'll hold that there for a while I call on the last questioner. Lito Tayag, one of our trustees. Lito, do you have a question? Could you ask your question?
All right. Thank you, Kova. Thank you, Dr. Diamond, for your presentation. I think it's very enlightening for me. My question is, you talk about the business and the media and other institutions that are assaulted and their roles in a declining democracy. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts around the role of the church as a separate institution in this context, or is it simply just another part of the opposition groups in this struggle? Thank you.
Well, I think, the role of the church is very important. And of course, it was critical to the achievement of democracy in the Philippines in 1986 and in Poland in 1989 and so on. And, it's pretty stunning when you look at democratic transitions around the world, how important a role religious institutions and leaders often have played. It is awkward for the church, and I wouldn't necessarily advise that the church become a blatantly partisan or political actor. But I think the church can stand for values and moral authority. And through its messaging, it can underscore the importance of accountability, corruption, fighting corruption, defending the integrity of democratic institutions, the independence of accountability agencies, the Human Rights Commission, the courts, and how remind people the sacrifices that were made. And I'll just conclude on a theme I've repeated over the course of our hour and a half together. We're in a short-term battle, but we're in a long-term battle, both in the Philippines and in the United States, but also globally. The short-term battle is to halt the deterioration and abuse of democratic institutions and restore our formal democracies to reality and good health. The longer-term battle is to renew the cognitive and moral commitment to democracy, understanding of democracy and liberal values. And here I think the church has a tremendous role to play in linking the teachings of the church, and frankly of all religious traditions, to basic democratic values of decency, consideration for others, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal. I mean, come on, thou shalt not murder, particularly without due process of law on the streets of major cities. You know, you don't have to always make it too politically explicit. There's a lot the church can do to link its teachings of a purely doctrinal and religious nature to the core principles of liberal democracy that are often being trashed on a daily basis. And sometimes if you do it a little bit more elliptically, you can gain more traction, and then there may come a moment again when an autocrat or an incipient autocrat tries to steal an election, and the church will be called upon to defend the ballot. But if it doesn't position itself as an explicitly political or partisan actor early on, but sticks to the level of morality and principles early on, and defense of basic principles of rule of law and human decency and honesty and so on, that may be the way to begin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diamond. My KPI usually is to end on time. I ask everyone's indulgence that we're a bit over time today. Before we end, I'd just like to acknowledge again the ambassadors who are with us today: Ambassador Riefenstahl of Germany, Ambassador Ho of Singapore, MacArthur of Canada, and Ambassador Stephen Robinson of Australia. Not all of them were here at the very beginning, but all of them are here as we end today. And as we end today, allow me to call on our partner. Thank you very much in advance to our partner, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the country head in the Philippines, Dr. Stefan Joost, for the closing remarks. Dr. Joost?
Yeah, thank you very much, Coco. And to be honest, I'm tempted to say it's all said, because Larry Diamond gave us not only an interesting and instructive overview, but also a message that could not be clearer and more impressive. And the message is that the Philippines left, as he said, the category of an electoral democracy. This is an alarming inventory by one of the internationally best-known democracy researchers, and it's always good and helpful to get a critical look from the outside. And it's worth and perhaps necessary to point this out. This is not about party politics. This is the result of a scientific analysis that takes the central elements of a democratic system as a starting point. And this investigation is embedded in a broad and long-term study on the performance of democracies. And regarding the Philippines, we saw in one of the slides that in the last 15 years, the Philippines is now at the lowest point in the democratic ranking in the history. And we saw that we are experiencing a democratic recession, that we experience the highest democratic breakdown during the last 10 years, and the rise of an illiberal populism. So regarding the Philippines, less than 2 years before the next presidential election, we are faced with a double risk or challenge. On the one hand, there is enough time to make things worse, or in the words of Larry Diamond, to implement and deepen the Autocrats' 12-step program. But on the other hand, I think there is also enough time to get active, to defend, to improve democracy, or in the areas where the democratic system is already damaged, to restore it. I'm absolutely convinced that today's debate will find a broad echo. We got a lot to think about, and together with our partner, the Makati Business Club, Coco will accept this challenge and consider it, how we can address this challenge, how we can contribute to an effective democracy in the Philippines. So my thanks to Larry Diamond for this, at the same time, disturbing and inspiring contribution. Thanks to MBC, Coco Alquaz, and his staff, my staff from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and all the participants for this very exciting and interesting discussion. Have a great day and stay safe. Stay safe.
Thank you, Mark. You should all get the book as well, because aside from the 12 steps for autocracy, there's I think, a 7-step out of autocracy in the book. So it doesn't end that way. As we end this series, and to bookend it, may I call on Ambassador Quisha for a final thank you and closing remarks. Ambassador? You're still on mute. Go ahead,
Okay.
go ahead.
Well, first let me thank Dr. Larry Diamond for his very excellent presentation and very thoughtful answers to the questions that have been raised. We thank you also for your suggestions on why we who love democracy should continue to promote democratic principles and values and continue our struggle to ensure that democracy survives in our country. We thank Dr. Stefan Yos and KAS for having partnered with the MBC today. And we thank Coco Alquaz and his MBC team for having organized this very interesting forum. And lastly, we want to thank everyone, all of you who have joined us for this forum today. Thank you.
We have a special request. Could I ask everybody to, who's willing to turn on their camera, and we'll take a group shot. Team, could you do that? I'm going to count to 3, 2 or 3 times, and our team will take a group shot of all of us. 1, 2, 3, and smile. 1, 2, 3, and smile. And 1, 2, 3, and smile. I'll do that one last time. 1, 2, 3, and smile. With that, I'd like to thank everybody. Larry, of course, the previous speakers, Emily Lau, Audrey Tang, for gracing this series. Thank you, of course, very much to KAS, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation, for being our partner here and hopefully our partner as we continue this process. Thank you to all the attendees, our board members, the ambassadors who attended, the partners and potential partners who are here today. Thank you very much to all of you. Larry, thanks again. Have a good evening, Larry. Have a good evening, Larry. And we're glad, by the way, Larry warned us that because of the forest fires, he might get cut off, but we made precautions for that, and thankfully it didn't encroach on Palo Alto too much. Larry, stay safe tonight, Larry.
Okay, you too.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Congratulations, Coco. Very good.
Thank you, Ambassador.
And the whole team. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Have a
Take
good day.
care.